Hello, and welcome to another edition of Ask the Professor, where we respond to your questions on history, economics, culture, government ineptitude, all those things that influence our life together as Canadians.
Right. Here's a good one about moral philosophy, and it requires a bit of a setup, and I will have to simplify greatly, but please bear with me. The question is whether you agree with the thesis of Giambattista Vico, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, who was a 17th, 18th century philosopher, and his thesis was that human society, human civilizations went around with a recurring cycle. First, you had the age of the gods, in which people lived in patriarchal communities and were ruled by priest kings. Then you had the age of heroes, in which the lower classes would start to rise a little bit, and then instead of having priest kings, you would have heroes, a bit like the Homeric epics, for instance. And the third age would be the age of peoples, where democracy, science, and reason would start to assert themselves. So that's the first part of this question, whether you agree with this cycle. And the second part of that question is, if you do agree with that cycle, how close do you think we are right now from the end of the third age?
Yeah, well, good old Giambattista, and I'm tempted to brush him aside with a comment that history doesn't fit such crude and simple schemas very well. But there is, I think, a core of truth in what he says, that in that societies initially rest on firm metaphysical foundations. They know who they are, they know what they believe, and there's a solid predictability about it. But as they develop and flourish, they become more inquisitive about the nature of their beliefs and the foundation of their institutions. They become more open to experiment. And this, it seems to me, produces a further flourishing, an increase in their wealth, an increase in their intellectual reach, an increase in their cultural dynamism. Unfortunately, as this happens, you do start to get the seeds of decay. His third phase is marked by irony. You get a kind of skepticism that turns on itself and starts to erode everything. And you get a change in the politics from excessive deference to authority to excessive deference to impulses. And in the end, you get basically barbarism without the vigor. And this is the stage that I do think we're very much heading into, and it worries me enormously, that we have pretty much trashed every institution that had given rise to the power of the West and made its example so irresistible. And everybody now thinks that they are their own little god. We've gone away from having, Jehovah to having our navel as the focus of our worship. And that is clearly an unsuitable way to conduct our affairs. Now, is this a cycle? I mean, did this happen to Rome? There used to be a lot of interest in whatever went wrong. Rome seemed to start so well. It became this world empire with many commendable features, including a devotion to the rule of law, that famous business in the New Testament where Paul is about to have some appalling thing done to him by the authorities in the eastern part of the Mediterranean because he's a troublemaker. And then he utters the magic words, Quibus Romanus sum, I am a Roman citizen. And they go, what? Really? Oh man, and then we've got to take you to Rome and do all this fairly. But then eventually something eroded the strength of Rome and it was overwhelmed by barbarians. The good news, and if this is good news, you know you're in trouble, is that these barbarians had that primal vigor. They were filled with energy and with conviction, and when they saw Rome, they started to adopt Roman law codes to aspire to be the new Romans. I think you could take it too far, though, because you get into the Dark Ages, which weren't that bad in the Middle Ages. I mean, did the Middle Ages die of this kind of cyclical problem where they became too cynical and ironic and had deconstructionist philosophers? Or if it's such a long thing that what we're talking about here is a cycle that runs from the 5th century through to the 20th, well, you're not going to have a lot of those cycles. I mean, maybe you think history is going to go on for 20,000 generations, but it might not. You could get a rude shock there. History might actually end and not because liberal democracy triumphed and we all got iPads. So I wouldn't put too much faith in the mechanical nature of the cycles, but I would say this. It does seem to me that there's a kind of progress from barbarism to vigorous sophistication to feeble postmodernism. And to the extent, whether it's a cycle or not, I think we're there now. We no longer know what we believe, and so the grunt and the howl take the place of reasoned discourse, and the will takes the place of a controlled sensible, integrated personality in a way that the id gets loose. We no longer feel a sense of sin. We no longer feel that we are flawed and must try to restrain ourselves. We just try to do whatever feels good. And when that happens, we become as vicious as barbarians, but far weaker than them. And any barbarians out there aspiring to conquer us now are so appalling that maybe it would just be simpler to kind of go back in time. Chesterton said, people say you can't turn back the clock. He says, of course you can turn back the clock. You just do it like this. It has been done. The Victorians, in fact, recaptured a great deal of inner strength from a society that looked as though it was becoming depraved and decadent. So let's focus on that. Let's focus on being vigorous without being barbaric, instead of being both feeble and barbaric, which seems to me is the worst of all possible worlds, whether it comes from the turning of a wheel or a straight line progress or just a bunch of bad decisions.
Right. Now I don't know if I should be depressed or inspired. Which one should I be?
Both.
Yes.
Don't be optimistic. Optimism is a psychological condition and a fatuous one, but hope is a theological virtue. So be realistic about the problem and hopeful about our ability to deal with it.
All right, I'll try that then. Thanks, folks. If you want to ask your question of the professor, the URL on your screen will take you to a page where it's all explained how you get to do that. Thanks, and see you next time.